What's up, everybody? Pastor Matthew here. Thanks for checking into the YouTube channel. Hey, today we're going to talk about the recent PCA General Assembly, which just took place a few days ago. This is the season, of course, in the summertime that many denominations, including our own, have our General Assemblies or our big conference meetings. I'm aware of the Southern Baptist Church and others having their conference meetings this summer, even in the past few days, overlapping perhaps a little bit with ours as well. And to help us understand all these things, I brought in one of my friends who's better than me on these topics for sure. Jared Nelson has been on this channel with me a couple of times before. We've done a couple of video interviews together. Jared is the pastor of New Life PCA here in Western Pennsylvania. I always want to call it New Hope, but that's the Star Wars theme. Jared, welcome to the channel. Thank you so much for coming on. Give us a little bit about you and your church.
Sure. My name is Jared Nelson, and I'm at New Life Presbyterian up in Aliquippa, Hopewell area, which is northwest of Pittsburgh. So if you're along 376, you hit exit 45, you're gonna get there. And then I've been here for almost 10 years now. I still feel like I'm new, but I guess after a decade, you can't say you're the new guy there. But just love the church, love the area. Eventually people in your congregation give you presents and you have to become a local sports fan and things like that. So yeah.
So why don't you lean into the New Hope kind of Mandalorian, Star Wars, Boba Fett thing? You're still holding out for New Life. Does anyone ever confuse those two anyways? I always want to say New Hope.
Yeah, I get New Hope all the time. So just don't type it in wrong, or you'll end up I think there's a New Hope in OPC down in Maryland. So don't get them confused.
Well, I'm sure they're pretty cool too.
Yeah.
Well, Jared, you're kind of a General Assembly junkie, which is why I lean on you heavy for these things related to our denomination. You've been in the PCA for years longer than me, and you seem to have kind of an affinity for and desire and a knowledge of how General Assemblies work at the minute level. How many General Assemblies have you been to now in the PCA?
Well, my first one was the 40th, and I've only missed one, so I think that would make 10. So I've been to 10 different General Assemblies.
That's a lot. Now, you've been on the Overtures Committee a few times, and we're going to explain what that is here in just a couple of minutes. How many times have you done the Overtures Committee?
This was my third time on Overtures Committee.
Oh, cool. That's awesome. Well, that's where a lot of the sausage is made, so to speak, as it comes to the overtures and whatnot. Well, if you're new to this channel, my name is Matthew Everhard. I'm the pastor of Gospel Fellowship PCA. I like Jared's church, which is a great one too. We're both part of the Ascension Presbytery here in Western Pennsylvania. So if you're looking for a Bible-believing, Reformed church that loves Christ and has a mission to share the gospel with the world, come check out either one of our churches, either New Life or Gospel Fellowship PCA. Well, Jared, this General Assembly, as you know, was a bit of a special one for us. We're celebrating our 50th anniversary here as a denomination, going all the way back to 1973. And this one, I didn't go, full disclosure. I was on vacation in Atlanta, Georgia, so I missed the whole thing. I will admit that I suffered from some FOMO, the fear of missing out. All my friends tweeting and texting and talking about what's happening at the General Assembly. I missed the whole thing. But was there kind of a feel of grandeur or celebration? What was different about this 50th celebration General Assembly versus other ones you've been to in the past?
Yeah, there was just a different feel to the whole assembly. Some of it related to them marking the fact that this was a 50th anniversary. They even gave the commissioners that were there some swag,
Nice.
A copy of the letter that they first sent out, and then a little challenge coin, which hopefully you got yours. I gave to David to give to you.
Yes, I got it, and it's pure gold. I take it, right? That's just.
I haven't had it tested yet, but there was a bit of a different feel, though, I think, to the whole assembly, because there's been issues in the PCA dealing with revoice and those issues, and it felt like a calm after the storm, that there wasn't as much of a tension in the air about how things would turn out. Even the overtures that were somewhat related to that passed pretty easily. I think 88% on the floor was the overture that was kind of like the final cleanup of language from previous ones in the previous years. So there wasn't just as much tension over those sorts of issues. So there was an assembly-wide seminar in which they talked to some of the founders that we still have with us, and made up of people like Paul Koistra, Charles McGowan, and Palmer Robertson. who was a treat. I feel like he took
Mhm.
us to church at the end of his talk, just of wanting to talk about scripture and the basis for having a denomination rather than just even the history. But it was good reflective time. I was in Overtures, and so Monday and Tuesday are a blur for me because you're just in committee meetings all day. So I'm sure that there were also great seminars during that time, but I just didn't get to go to them.
Yeah, sometimes when you go to these General Assembly meetings, and I know it's true for the Southern Baptists who just had their convention, that sometimes you feel like you're gearing up for a street fight. It has that feel of you're going to meet after school at the flagpole and duke it out, especially if there's a really, hot topic, kind of controversial issue. And I've felt that a few times before going to General Assemblies, that you just feel just the mood in the room is tense, and there's going to be this confrontation. You're waiting for a certain overture to come up, and people are going to bang it out, metaphorically speaking, but it didn't have that sense of a feel of confrontation this time. It felt more of a celebration.
Yeah, and I think for a bit of a feel of that tone, if you can watch one thing from it, the worship on Tuesday evening that had a really, I think, helpful pastoral prayer by Sean Lucas that focused on the events that had happened in Nashville at Covenant Church there in school, as well as losing some major names such as Harry Reeder and Tim Keller and Steve Smallman. And so some of that was because that was in the air. There was a little bit of a knowing that this was a different feel, a different GA.
Yeah, that's true. We had suffered a few serious losses, not only the Nashville tragedy, but then a couple of our stalwart leaders had passed away just weeks before the General Assembly. And so what was supposed to be a big and beautiful moment, and I'm sure it still was in one sense, ended up being a little bit more of a commemoration of a couple of tragedies back to back to back in that sense. How was the preaching and the worship time? Sometimes we forget that a General Assembly is more than just a business meeting, but it's actually a gathered worship of the church, being the church.
Yeah, it was. We had 3 different times of worship that met. 2 of which I missed because of committee meetings or meetings that went over. But the first night was good, and so I'm going to go back and listen to Ligon Duncan. I think was on Wednesday, and a guy named Leslie Newsom, I believe, was the Thursday night. And so those are certainly worthy to go back and watch. I remember my first experience with GA was going to see Phil Ryken preach just for the worship service before I was ordained. So those are definitely more of a everybody come in and participate time.
Yeah, yeah. Well, Jared, let's back up just a bit because maybe we've lost some people already with terms like General Assembly and Overtures Committee and things like that. Could you just frame it up for us, big picture here? So how does Presbyterian work? We know that we're an elder-based system. We have the local church session, and then there's the more regional presbyteries. How does the General Assembly fit into the whole mechanism of Presbyterian ecclesiology, and what exactly does the General Assembly normally do?
Well, the General Assembly is our highest court. So we think sometimes in Presbyterianism of different levels acting as a court. The session does, that is your local group of elders, and they act as a court when they have to judge matters or do discipline or things like that. And then the level that's above them is presbytery, where you go through ordination exams. And then the General Assembly acts as a highest court. If there's a dispute that happens between a church and a presbytery, or something that can't be settled between a couple of presbyteries, it will go to the highest court. So it does that. It provides some oversight, but also on a more positive note, it organizes some ministries that you can't do as well just on the local level, such as mission to the world, missions, M&A, church planting to help with some uniformity between the presbyteries of how that's done and surveys and things. RUF, which is our college ministry that gets ordained ministers into colleges to do campus ministry, and some other things like CDM that does some publishing. So some of those things that we can't do as well individually, we come together and do together, and then we provide oversight for them to say, are you doing the things that we asked you to do, and what can you report back to us on that?
So General Assembly as a whole has kind of a threefold feel to it. On one sense, it truly is a worship service where we gather together and we actually hear the preaching of the word. And then on the other hand, it's a business meeting where we're actually working through a docket and an agenda. But there's also kind of an aspect to it where a General Assembly is kind of like a conference. It's a place to meet up with old friends, to do some networking. There's usually sort of an exhibition hall where you can go out and you can talk to people from other ministries and things like that. Jared, one of the things that's kind of funny about the PCA is several years ago, we revamped our logo for our denomination, and a number of people could not help but notice that it did look like the helmet of Boba Fett from Star Wars or Mandalorian. I want to real quick share my screen here and show the folks, if you're watching on YouTube instead of listening as a podcast, Moses Lee, who's on Twitter, he did an AI art generation where he asked to look at a General Assembly from the view of Mandalorian. So here's Moses's Twitter, and he did some kind of really cool ones here. We've got these ones here meeting as the Westminster Assembly. I thought that was pretty awesome. And then this one here, I really like this one because this one actually kind of looks like, doesn't this actually look like what it really feels like when you're in the room a little bit?
That looks like the hall at the at GA this year. Yes.
Yeah, it's kind of funny because most of the time, in order to have a General Assembly for the PCA, we're a pretty large denomination, we have to rent some mammoth size hall or conference room or something like that. And more, it certainly does look like like that picture right there. Well, Jared, we're going to take a look at some of the important things that came up in this General Assembly and kind of review some of the things that were accomplished. One of the things that typically happens, if not every time, is that the stated clerk of our denomination gives a big picture summary of the health of the denomination as a whole. What did you hear about the PCA in terms of its health and its mission and its vibrancy?
Well, it actually was pretty positive. If you were to ask the question right after COVID, we had a little bit of a dip in membership, but that was quickly replaced by what the stated clerk characterized as modest growth. We are somewhere in between this 375 and 400,000 member mark, which the previous one that we would throw out was 350. But the one thing he noted was a lot more of that is coming from adult baptisms.
Interesting.
Yeah, which means that you have more conversions, people that had not been in the church before. And we rejoice over our covenant children coming to faith and joining the church, but we also rejoice when those that have been outside of the church that have no experience with it before are coming in. And so that was really encouraging to hear that we're not just keeping our children, but that we're adding people from outside into the church. And that was an encouraging note.
Yeah, that's really cool. In fact, our Baptist friends, we love our brothers who are Baptist, though we may disagree with them on some things. They really consider adult baptisms to be one of the main statistics of church vibrancy or life. And not that we can quantify the kingdom of God necessarily like the back of a baseball card with statistics or anything like that. But if you're looking at numbers, my goodness, what more could you rejoice in than baptisms? That's a wonderful thing. Did you hear anything, not to put you on the spot, but about the number of churches in terms of church planting? Was there growth? Was there retraction there? Are we about the same as we were last year when it comes to the number of churches?
You know, I don't have those statistics in front of me, but it sounded like there was modest growth in terms of churches. But we'd have to look at the actual number to know that. The one thing that I did hear that I thought was really interesting, just in putting things in perspective, another report was from MTW and talking about our missions force, that actually, if you were to look throughout history and look at this time too, that right now through MTW and their efforts to plant churches that even have a denomination starting in the Ukraine, a Presbyterian denomination,
Wow.
Poland,
Yeah.
one that's underway in Cambodia, Japan, that actually MTW and the PCA is fielding the largest Reformed missionary force in history.
Wow.
Not just right now, not just among others, but in history. So that was something that was really encouraging to hear too.
Yes, praise God for that. That is awesome. Now, will those form their own presbyteries then? And in what sense would they be related to us as the PCA?
More mother-daughter, they would be eventually self-functioning. I know Ukraine is a little bit further along than some of these other places, but we've been in Japan for a long time. And so the exciting thing is that there's such a focus that has been on missions throughout the PCA's history that if the PCA were to cease to exist, still mission efforts around the world would still show the influence of and faithfulness to God in doing mission.
Yeah, praise God. That's awesome. Well, let's jump into a little bit of the controversy that we've had for more than a few years now in terms of the revoice movement. I think the last time you and I talked, Jared, we had just broken some news about Greg Johnson and Memorial PCA in the St. Louis area taking a vote to leave the PCA. That being said, was revoice an issue that we dealt with at this General Assembly? Was there any sense in which there were some lingering ramifications of that controversy, or do we now have the sense that this has been put behind us?
A little bit of both. There was one of the things we do when we gather is vote on what might be changes to our BCO.
Yeah.
Our BCO is our Book of Church Order, how we examine officers, qualifications, things like that. And you can really tell the difference, just to use a visual prop here. This is the PCA's BCO, and you'll notice it's in a 3-ring binder because it seems like we change it so often.
Right.
This is the OPC's. They actually bind theirs, so they don't change it quite as often. But we had a couple of BCO overtures that were, or changes that were before us that were both approved pretty overwhelmingly. 29, 31, you can look them up, about examination and about qualifications. And some of this is getting to, if you look at the qualifications for elders in 1 Timothy 3, Titus 1, and if you were to list out what is the focus, most of the focus is on Christian character and piety. And there is just in there apt to teach, that they're able to teach. And much of what we do in our process is we really examine you to see if you're able to teach.
Yeah.
And then also there's Christian character. And so this was balancing that out a little bit in other areas too. So those passed pretty overwhelmingly. There were several different overtures that we're trying to get at the last issue that we really couldn't hammer out last year, which was self-descriptive type language, and seemed to reach something of a consensus on one of them. It was this year's 23. But when it came out and it was eventually voted on, the vote was nearly 89% for it. So it may have been controversy in kind of one sense of the word, but it seems like it's something that there's been a lot of consensus that's been reached of how to address it and how to have our standards. So it felt like it was the final kind of steps on it at that level. And then really it's a matter of presbyteries do your work, churches do your work to teach, to examine, and to move from there.
Now, just remind us here about how an overture works. So an overture would come to the General Assembly one year, and supposing it passes, it goes out to the presbyteries for approval across the presbyteries of the nation, and then it comes back to the General Assembly the next year. Is that correct?
Yeah, if it's a BCO change, if it's changing what we're doing in our book. Some overtures just ask us to make a statement or provide guidance or something along those lines. But if it's a BCO change, something that changes how we do our Church of Book Order, it has to be approved at one General Assembly, approved by 2/3 of the presbyteries, and then come back, and then the next General Assembly has to approve it as well, so that we don't change things on a whim too often, or just when one General Assembly happens to have one sort of a flavor. This is really to reflect the will of the denomination.
So the character related overtures that you just mentioned related to ordination and being an officer in the church, those have now been approved at the first General Assembly across the presbyteries, and now they're in. Then they're going to make it into the changes in the Book of Order for the next coming edition. Is that correct?
That's correct. Number 29 and 31 of last year have been approved, and there's this new one that's 23 that really just goes down to officers in the church need to speak in a biblical way about themselves. And so it's a little bit less particular than 15 was aiming to be, but is still getting at using biblical standards for our self-descriptions of ourselves. So that was just approved, and that will go to presbyteries, but again, was not as controversial. There was, it was interesting being in overtures. We deal with these and we give a recommendation or edit them for the GA to vote on, because it's hard for 2,250 people that was the commissioners this year to amend something on the floor. So it's a smaller committee that does that. And there's actually a group that wanted something that was a little bit more specific, and they thought about doing a minority report, which was to give them a different option. They got together, and when they made edits to say, here's what people are saying, here's how we answer objections, they basically said, well, this is Overture 23. So it kind of had more consensus of, I think this is what everybody could get around.
Now, you mentioned being on the Overtures committee. When I transferred from the EPC to the PCA, that was something that was completely new to me because we didn't quite do it that way. And I'm not sure whether the OPC or the ARP or the RPCNA have something like an Overtures committee, but fill that out for me a little bit. How does the PCA's use of an Overtures committee function to streamline the actual assembly meeting itself?
Yeah, the OPC does not have one, and it's partly because when they gather, they have a delegated assembly, and so they have between 1 and 200 people, and that large of a group can act as a deliberative body, make amendments. When the full General Assembly is gathered, you have about 2,000 people, and maybe this is the difference between like the Senate and the House of Representatives. Once you get too large, it takes a long time to do things, and what they found was, once they had grown to larger numbers, they needed committees to do this work and then just have the assembly vote up or down what the committee had done. So Overtures Committee takes these overtures that are from presbyteries requesting the GA to do something, make a statement, change this in the BCO, and then they say, we think that the assembly probably would like this, but we'll make a little edit here, clean up some language. Maybe you were sloppy, you said shall when you meant should, or should when you said shall, or something like that. And then we basically clean it up and present it to the General Assembly. This year, they did everything that the Overtures Committee said recommended. So I hopefully we did a good job if they just said, yeah, that's what we want to do. So
now, you and I, we probably share a lot of convictions, not only in terms of our doctrine, but perhaps even in some of our leanings. Not to divide the PCA by the use of labels and things like that, but for those who would identify themselves as being conservative or confessional, would you say that the changes that made it into the Book of Order are a step in the right direction, or would you say that they're a step in the wrong direction as far as that goes?
they were definitely something that the more conservative or confessional side of the PCA had been pushing for. But I also think it's something that what you might call the middle of the PCA seem to want to. And there's a lot of ways people have divided that up. I think Keller and Marsden had this doctrinal pietist and contextualist or missional wings. I sometimes think on the more strict versus more broadly evangelical realm. So those that were on the more reformed confessional wing, these were things that they had been wanting for a while. And so that's really who had been pushing a lot of these things. But again, once we got to 23, once you get an 89% consensus on something, it seems to be broadly acceptable to the church and a lot of its different wings.
Yeah, the PCA is not really a denomination that you can divide into the conservatives and the liberals per se, because there really isn't a liberal movement in the PCA. We're all conservative, Bible believing, reformed people who have a very high view of Scripture and subscription to the Westminster Confession of Faith. But even within that, of course, you can kind of substriate people according to preferences on particular issues. So we don't mean to overuse categories, but Jared, there was a kind of a new discussion that took place this year. At least it was new to me. We might have talked about it here in the past, but I don't really remember it. Regarding testimony in the church courts, there had been some controversy about who is able and permitted to give testimony. At a church session, a presbytery, or a general assembly. The question pertaining to those who don't profess faith in Christ or God at all. What was the substance of that debate, and where did it end up at this year's GA?
Yeah, one thing that sometimes Revoice has overshadowed has been a discussion on how do we deal with abuse in the church. There was a report that was heard a couple of years ago called the DASA report. It's basically domestic abuse report on preventing some of these things in our churches, and what do you do in church discipline in regards to that. And some of the recommendations that it made, more like suggestions, they weren't able to propose overtures, but some of those suggestions that they made were adopted in the previous General Assembly, made it through, such as if you have somebody that wants to testify in a church court, you have a right for the accused to see their accuser. But to be able to have like the accuser use a video conference so that they don't have to be in the room with somebody that they may not be emotionally in a place that they can be at.
Yeah, you can see where that'd be a real just human emotional situation.
Yeah. Well, there are some proposals that were a little bit less um, popular or consensus proposals, and one of them was changing our vows so that somebody who is not a professing believer could could testify in a church court, which typically hasn't been allowed. Our BCO and those provisions actually go way back to the older Presbyterian church and go back about 200 years, that you have to have some belief in God or belief in eternal rewards and punishments to take an oath. And some of that is because the church court isn't the same as the civil court. In the civil court, you commit perjury and they can hold you liable for that. They can fine you. They can even put you in prison.
Right.
Church court doesn't have the power of the sword. And so there has to be some sort of boundaries of taking testimonies and what do we accept in a church court. And a lot of times a church court is reacting. If somebody has done something that's criminal, the civil court is the realm that you call. You call 911. You don't call your local session first if there's been physical or something like that. So a lot of times once the civil court has done its work, the church court responds to that. So the things that we were dealing with were some of these narrow sort of situations in which it wasn't quite at the level of a civil court, and who are we taking testimony from? And so that was the one area that I think had the most controversy around was, do we do away with this or do we keep it? Eventually we decided not to take the recommendation to do away with having that vow, to allow those who aren't believers to testify in a church court. And some of the debate behind that was it was kind of a narrow vote. However, when the case was made, it was a lot of these are hypotheticals. This isn't coming out of a case in which if we just had this, things would have been different, and to really make the case that it would do more help than it would harm. And they didn't really make the case that way, although I think they made a case of there are some hypotheticals that would be that we need to think about. And so there actually may be some things that are proposed in the future, maybe not changing the vow, but other ways to take testimony or evidence and things like that if a church court is considering discipline on someone.
Yeah, you could see how this would be a very difficult question to iron out, because on one hand, you might have a witness to a particular sin or a crime or something terrible or tragic that happens in a church context, and the fact that they're not a Christian wouldn't necessarily mean that their experience didn't happen and what they saw wasn't real. But on the other hand, you could easily make the case that a person should be a believer, and at least, as you mentioned, believe in rewards and punishments after this life, because otherwise, what would prevent them from lying before the church in that case? And if the church doesn't have the power to punish as the civil magistrate or the civil courts might, then how can it even safeguard the process as being, according to truth, with everybody wanting to testify towards what is true? So the vote ended up being, Jared, then to support and sustain the assumption that all people giving testimony would in fact be believers. Is that correct?
Yeah, it was about 60-40 on the proposal to change it. And it was to stick with what we have now. So it was, with a close vote like that, you can see there might be something where somebody's like, well, let's try this other approach that doesn't touch that, but maybe gets at some of the issues that they were getting at.
Now, shifting gears here, we know, if we were following Twitter at all, that our Southern Baptist friends had a major controversy related to women preachers. I think Rick Warren was in the thick of it as he was tweeting all week long about whether or not women should be preachers in the church. We had a little bit of a discussion too, though not nearly to the heated degree that the Southern Baptist churches did related to women preachers. But that topic actually came up, didn't it? What happened there, Jared? There was also another discussion, and you can comment on either one, about the use of titles in the church for people that are not actually ordained. I guess perhaps throwing around the term pastor a little bit too sloppily. Can you comment on either one of those those discussions?
Yeah, it actually came up in kind of three different ways. One, there was an overture that came to us, but actually through a provision in which a presbytery rejected it, but a church session sent it, that wanted us to make a change in which we restricted what the context for women preaching and teaching. However, it wanted us to restrict it in such a way that was a lot broader than what we've done before, that had some questions about like, well, what about conferences? And are we defining teaching in the same way amongst each other? And so we said no to that because we thought it was too broad. But there was also an issue that came up with a church that had somebody that was not ordained in the PCA, obviously, a woman who preached in the pulpit on a Sunday morning where they had communion. And this came up through a review of Presbyterian records. And what the General Assembly decided to do was to send that to our Standing Judicial Commission, saying that this is not something that is allowed currently under our standards. So we didn't broaden out the definition, but we did say, PCA is a complementarian denomination, especially when in regarding worship on Sunday mornings. And so that shows you that process is functioning within the PCA. The other thing was a overture about who can use the titles for ordained office. In the PCA, there's two ordained offices. There's deacon and elder, and elder includes the two classes of teaching elder. We think of as pastors and ruling elders, although you can also call ruling elders pastors in a sense. Sure. And this proposal was narrowly defined by the time we were done to just only those unordained people cannot use the titles or be referred to by the titles of pastor / elder or deacon. And this is a proposal of a change to the BCO, what we think is probably already implicit in there, but would make it explicit, just so that, and some of this, it can just be sloppy. I mean, you think of a church that hires a youth guy, was he a youth director, coordinator, or was he a youth pastor? And it would just be clear of, hey, until he passes ordination, refer to him as the youth director before he becomes a youth pastor. So there's a lot of different circumstances in which this would at least maintain those three words for those that are ordained.
Yeah, that's kind of a term that just kind of has seeped into churches by way of generic evangelical culture. I think most non-denominational churches would not really have a problem with the term youth pastor. Youth pastor could mean to refer to the fact that he's a young pastor, he's a youth pastor, or he's a pastor to the youth, but it's just a term that we throw around to be the guy that leads the kids or teens ministry. But the word pastor takes on a little bit more of a technical title, and so we should be perhaps more careful with the way that we use that term. Was that the context that brought up this discussion, generic use of the word youth pastor? Is that how that became a topic?
I think it was multiple things. There was pastor, and then there's also there are some churches that will have gotten into the habit of not ordaining their deacons. Some think that there should be ordination of women to be deacons, and this is a small number of churches. And so in order to do that, they won't ordain any of them and just commission. And so this was actually following the women's study report that we had, that one of the recommendations was that churches need to ordain their deacons. And in a sense, we're saying ordain them, and those are the deacons. You might have other groups that are doing other things and that have different titles. We call deacons assistants. Some churches in the old RPCES even called them deaconesses, but distinguished them from deacons. But this was saying, let's just reserve the titles of the ordained office just for those who are ordained. And that was about a 75% vote. So it was actually pretty large. That has to go to the presbyteries to approve, though, now.
Yeah, very good. Well, one more controversial topic or two before we sign off for today. I wanted to discuss with you one of the things that came up regarding transgenderism and what is so-called trans-affirming care for young persons and minors. We actually took a bit of an unusual opportunity to make a stand as a denomination. Tell us a little bit about what we said. What was the overture related to gender-affirming care and transgenderism amongst minors?
Yes, this was Overture 12, if you're looking for them on the website. And this requested the General Assembly to send a petition to the government to renounce the sin of sex change operations, especially for minors. And this was something that if you were to take a vote at the GA about are you in favor of a sex change operation, you would probably have 2,000 against, and then like 4 people who got confused that hit the wrong button, right? It's the moral issue behind it. everybody's agreed on. The real question was twofold. One was, should we petition the government? Is this a case that's extraordinary? We have a distinction between the realms of the church and the state, and our confession says that we petition in cases extraordinary.
Mhm.
And that was the question: is this a case that's extraordinary? We had petitioned last year on the issue of abortion pretty overwhelmingly,
Mhm.
and we kind of were agreed on that. This was a little bit more of a, is this an extraordinary case? And then the second question that came up was, there was a suggested letter that almost everybody had some sort of a problem with. Not enough scripture, it focused too much on this, something like that. And in the end, nobody liked the letter that was there, it seemed like, because one objection or another. We couldn't draft a letter as a committee, because 140 people trying to write a letter, it's not going to turn out well. You need just a couple of people. So at first, the Overtures committee was going to suggest we send it back to the Presbyterian to give us something different to work with. But then we actually reconsidered it and said, how about we just have the moderator appoint somebody? We know that we're kind of agreed on this, and see if the GA really does want to send this as a petition, give them the option to do it, but just have the moderator appoint a commission to do it. And that's what ended up passing. It was a vote on the floor that I think was kind of like a 66% or something like that. But all of the debate really was, is this a role for the church to petition the government over, not the actual moral issue behind it?
Yeah, I've got the actual numbers here. I guess it was 1,089 to something like 793, which when I first thought about that, I thought, man, that sounds awfully close on a moral issue that should not be close at all. But I think you're exactly right when you articulated that people that voted no for that, it doesn't mean that they're in favor of gender affirming care for minors. Rather, it has more to do with when is it appropriate for the church to speak a word of rebuke to the government. And that even in itself is a debate that comes down to some of the language in the Westminster Confession of Faith and that chapter on the civil magistrate. There's some who would say that we should only give our opinion when we're specifically asked for it. And then would be others who would say that we are supposed to speak whenever we think that it's a matter that's extraordinary. And then there would be others probably who would say that we should be just constantly rebuking the government about everything that irritates us. So what were some of the what was the tenor in the room for that particular vote? Was that particularly intense, or was most of that discussion rather controlled?
I think it was passionate in some ways, but also I think we understood what we were debating, which was mostly, is this classified as a case extraordinary, or was it not? In some ways, we weren't talking about some of the substance of it a lot of the time. We're just talking about whether we should petition on it. So I think there was, overall, in all of the GA, maybe with the exception of the minority report that came up about the oath, it was pretty respectful in terms of its debate. And even that was respectful. It was just, there was a lot of passion that people had on both sides of that issue that was coming out. But at the end of it, I think where we ended up was we were able to, I think, all live with the decisions that came out of that and know where we need to go from here. And so that was part of I think the feel of it was, another lesson I think I took out of it was, if you were willing to work for consensus on an issue, that to get as many people on board as possible, things went through. Other people that were working on some things that they wanted to see come through didn't really have an idea of, well, how can we change the language, or how can we work on a compromise? When that wasn't an option, things didn't pass. Things like there was a suggestion of having a requirement for criminal background checks, but that didn't eventually go through. And I think if it was worded as suggested or recommended, it probably would have.
Yeah.
Probably with this too, if there's something that was found that was some sort of a workaround to not change the vows, it would have happened. But because there wasn't kind of a compromise ready to go, it didn't make it through.
Well, I want to look real quickly here, if I can share my screen again, to an article that just came out on Fox News before you and I hit record. And that is this one right here: Church body calls on politicians to renounce the sin of promoting transgender procedures for minors. commission, including medical experts, to draft Presbyterian Church in America's formal petition. So there's the article right there. It just came up on Fox. Let's just scroll down here and read the opening paragraph. It says, an influential conservative Presbyterian denomination. Well, that's nice. I guess we're considered influential, Jared. Recently agreed to formally petition government authorities against promoting transgender procedures for minors in a rare rebuke of government officials from the church. Now, this, of course, is probably going to be reduced to the size of a tweet, and that'll get bantied about the internet, I'm sure, provoking all kinds of opinions, both hostile and sympathetic. But this paragraph here, the next one, the Presbyterian Church in America, which held its 50th General Assembly in Memphis, Tennessee last week, approved by a vote of 1,089 to 793 an overture to urge the government to renounce the sin of promoting irreversible sex change procedures for children. A commission to be appointed by the Assembly's moderator will be tasked with drafting the petition. I'm a little bit worried about that paragraph, Jared, because some of the nuance that you and I just went through about why 793 people might say no to that will be lost in this discussion. And a lot of people are going to look at that and they're going to say, man, that number was way too close. It almost looks like, a huge chunk of the PCA is in favor of these kinds of surgeries or so-called gender affirming care. But that's really not what we've discussed, is it?
Yeah. If you go further down, and that's if people keep on reading, our moderator, the moderator that we elected this year was Pastor Fred Greco, actually gives some context to that, where he said that he noted that the debate on the overture hinged on what extent the church should involve itself in state affairs. I think that's in like paragraph 8 or 9. So hopefully people read down that far to understand the context for that vote.
Yeah, here it is right here. It says the Reverend Fred Greco, who served as the moderator for the PCA's 50th General Assembly, said he is not aware of anyone in the denomination who supports transgenderism in any capacity, but he noted that the debate on the overture hinged on to what extent the church should involve itself in state affairs. Okay, that's exactly what you just said, Jared. Did you do that from memory? That was great.
Oh, no, I was reading it on my phone there. So.
Oh, okay. Yeah,
Yeah.
I just requoted exactly what you just said. Well, what's nice about the Fox News article is it does have here the PDF. So if anybody is really interested in wonky Presbyterian ecclesiology, they can go on there and have a look at that document in and of itself. So that's pretty cool. Well, I'm glad we made Fox News. That's great, I guess, huh?
Yeah.
Well, Jared, yeah, go ahead, wrap up thoughts, and then we'll close out for today.
Yeah. Overall, I was really pleased with, this was my favorite GA that I've been to. I've been to about 10, and this was the one that I felt like had the most harmony. It was a retrospective, but the first sermon was actually on lament, and that we began as a denomination that lamented that we had to exist. And just the tenor of the entire assembly, I think, was refreshing. And I thank the host committee and Presbyterian AC for putting it on. They actually said that they're going to be sending out something, some sort of 50th anniversary book, or maybe a collection of testimonies or something, in the next few days. There's a few other things with the 50th that you might see. I know the Presbyterian Confessional Journal is going to put together some sort of a 50th anniversary with essays about it. I do know of one other pastor who in the next few days might be talking about, he's putting together a 50th anniversary history of the GAs of the PCA. So if you want to read more on it, there's going to be more stuff that's out there for you to do that.
Well, that is great. And speaking of 50th anniversary parties, we here at Ascension Presbytery in Western Pennsylvania, we're having a little party of our own on Sunday night here at Gospel Fellowship PCA. We'll be worshiping out in the pavilion. Yours truly preaching, but we're going to have people from the Presbytery coming in. Any chance you're going to be there, Jared?
We have our own church activities that are going on, but I'll check with my wife and see if we can schedule it in. So, because that sounds like a great time.
Yeah, fair enough. Well, it should be wonderful. And if you're in the area, come check us out. Again, Gospel Fellowship PCA. Well, Jared Nelson, thank you so much from New Life, aka New Hope PCA, for joining us on this channel today. You did a wonderful job highlighting and summarizing some of the most important things at this year's General Assembly. Thank you so much for tuning in today, everybody. I love you lots, and we will talk to you later.